It's just, there we go. All right, so welcome, an official welcome, and Michael and I will both introduce ourselves. So I'm Charity Garcia. I have experience in teaching high school as well as middle school, and some lower elementary, but not very much. I've taught both nationally and here in the States in urban contexts with primarily minority students my whole teaching career, and then have recently transitioned in the last year and a half to and teacher ed. So I have a passion for helping all students, including and probably mostly focused on hardest to serve. So that's some of my background. Okay. And so, Professor Gale.
Hi, I'm Michael Gale. I come from a background of teaching in all grade levels, kind of pre-K through college, and the way I got to do that was through music. My background is in music and the arts, and I have been able to teach at every grade level. Worked as a school principal and associate superintendent for schools. So have touched on I think just about every aspect of the K-12 environment, and have a special love for my students and seeing them succeed at no matter what grade level they are, and no matter what the background of those students is. So I am glad to be here, and glad to be able to share with you today on classroom management.
And so, if you would share with us, just in brief, I know you were sharing if I was understanding correctly, you're at an academy in Georgia, primarily African-American middle-class students.
Urban, correct? Yes. And they're largely urban students.
Largely urban environment.
Yeah, of course, Atlanta. So that's usually the issues that I have with them. They talk a lot. Of course, now we're in Generation Y, and as one person said, they're Generation Multitask. All right, screenagers, and so that's usually what we have. So because of the introduction to technology in the classroom, the problem of paying attention, keeping students engaged, focused, and for the entire time is a little bit more challenging than before.
Now, what content areas do you teach?
I teach Bible. Yeah, and so I'm using, of course, as this is of course Atlanta. This is an Adventist school, and they just rolled out the new Encounter curriculum, so that's what we've been using, Encounter curriculum. But the purpose of this meeting, I'm hoping that I can learn something and take it back to my colleagues, because they too are experiencing the same issues and even greater, of course, for different reasons. But let me just share something. One of my teachers was just refused to go on a class trip just recently with a group of students because of the challenges that she was experiencing with the students in her class. So clearly, classroom management and rapport with students is a big issue currently for our school.
Okay. So we have some great opportunity here. So Michael and I heard a little bit of a presentation. This is being recorded so that if you find that what we're sharing with you, you'd like to be able to share with your colleagues, then there'll be a link available, and they'll be participating that way as well. And
interestingly, as you said that, now that I'm doing this Zoom, I wish I had actually taken the initiative to share the information with them so they can actually be a part of this. And so clearly, I'm glad you said that, because as soon as we're finished with this, I'm going to clearly email it to all of them using the RenWeb system so they can actually benefit from it as well.
Good.
Wonderful. So yeah, so we'll have some presentation so that your colleagues and others that watch this as a recorded session will be able to have some foundation. And with your specific classroom, specific school, specific kids, I'm sure that we'll have some time to talk through some of those nuances as well.
Okay.
So we have, Michael, do you want to share your screen, or would you like me to?
I'm not able. I'm on my iPad. I had to transition.
Okay, so I will share.
iPad, so yeah. Thanks.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to share my screen here, so that you can see some of the slides that we are showing. Okay, so that we just talked about what our names are and so on. So what I'd like to start with is, what is the primary purpose of Adventist education? And so when we think about the primary purpose of Adventist education, oftentimes we think in education our primary purpose is to inform. Certainly from a classroom management point of view, sometimes we think our role is to help students conform. And really, if we're looking at the part of Adventist education, we can see particularly, as you mentioned, using Encounter in the schools and so on. You've received the training about the transform, right? Our primary purpose in Adventist education is for transformation. So when we look at the lordship model that was presented as a part of the Encounter rollout, we can see that if we're asking our students to have high performance, whether that's particularly in relational areas like classroom management, but we have low relationship, then really what we're asking them to do is to conform and to do that as a slave mode. If we have low expectations of performance and low relationship, then we're just asking them to dabble at greatness. And we're recognizing that we are, in a transformational way, trying to help our children to grow into a relationship with God as a partner and as a friend. That we need to meet children where they're at and then help transition them. So in that way, we need to have high relationship and be moving towards high performance. And so reality check, right? So that's all nice and happy and theoretical. And then we have our students who, as we were talking earlier, start getting up in the middle of class and playing shadow games and fixing their hair and, on the whiteboard. So what challenging student behaviors may appear? So I'd like you to just have a little bit of a glance at this. These are determined in the flight, fight, and freeze responses of the brain. And so there's some specific ones here. Have a look and see which ones stand out for you with the student behaviors in your classroom.
So Charity,
Okay.
I'm not able to see that on the screen.
Yeah, we're not able to see.
Oh, you're not able to see. Let me
No.
Let me try this again. Let's see. How about now?
Yes.
Yay. Okay. I'm so glad that you brought that up. Okay. So, so now that you can see, have a look at those flight, fight, and freeze behaviors. Which ones stand out to you?
Yeah, I'm looking right now. I don't know what it is, but I'm having a hard time seeing them because I'm using my phone, and so the text is really small.
Let me share with you out loud, and you can see what things were.
Yes.
So in the flight category, do you have students who withdraw?
Withdraw?
Mm-hmm. Withdraw, kind of go into themselves.
Yes, 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 definitely.
Flee the classroom, just up and leave.
Yes,
Skip class.
yes,
Constantly are daydreaming.
yes,
Appear to be asleep.
yes.
Are avoiding others. Are hiding or wandering around.
Beg your pardon, say it again.
Avoiding others.
Possibly, yes.
Okay. Hiding or wandering around the classroom.
And wandering around the class. Yes, sometimes it's just wandering around the classroom, and you wonder.
Okay.
Something like when a student would get up and walk behind the back of the teacher to hide something. It's just weird.
Okay. And then becoming disengaged.
Yes.
Those are flight behaviors, and we'll talk more about what these mean. The fight behaviors that you may see is acting out, behaving aggressively, acting silly, exhibiting defiance, being hyperactive, arguing, and screaming.
I think you're describing our students perfectly.
Okay, let's look at the freeze mode. Exhibiting numbness. To what's
Not
going
really.
on around
I'm
them.
not seeing that.
Okay, refusing to answer a question.
Yes.
Refusing to get their needs met.
Yes.
Giving a blank look.
Yes.
Feeling unable to move or act.
I've not seen that one.
Okay, so those are a bunch of challenging student behaviors that you are saying, wow, you know, we really have those and are facing them. Are there any others that you can add that maybe we didn't cover?
I think for one, student ran around the classroom. I remember recently another student taking his clothes off, his shirt off, while the teacher's back was turned to him. And so I think you've adequately described all the behaviors that I've seen since I've been in the school and continue to see.
So then I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and Michael's going to take us through the so now what. We know that these behaviors are real. You've shared with us that they're very real in your classrooms. And so now we want the so now what. So please make sure that this is indeed sharing for you on the screen. There we go.
There we go. And you can just go to the next slide. So thinking about the purpose of Adventist education and our role in bringing students into a restored, redemptive relationship with Christ, and how they will move, as Charity has pointed out, through our education spaces in that lordship kind of discipling model, where we get them to the point where they're really restored to the image of God, and that's our purpose. So when we think about discipline, we would think about that in redemptive terms. So everything that you described in terms of those behaviors, those fight, flight, and freeze behaviors that you identified, those are all kind of not, you could say they're not atypical, right? So we see those, but it's our response to those behaviors which makes a difference. So I'm going to describe several different kinds of responses, and then we'll key in on one, and that is the redemptive. So one type of response is authoritarian. That's a very severe response. It attempts to break the child's will, and it just says, you know what, you're going to do what I say do, no matter what. It's just what it is. There's a permissive response, and this is kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum, if you will. This is very indulgent. permits a child to do whatever they want. You know, some people say, well, you know, we're being too hard on these kids. We just need to let them let them grow and let them be. And that's kind of that permissive response. And it mistakenly, I believe, says that, you know, love makes the punishment superfluous, right? So, and then there's the bombastic response. This is an angry response that threatens the child's will, and it's kind of inconsistent because you could be in one moment, saying to the child, well, this is the way you should do it, and if you don't do it, these are the things that this is going to be the punishment. If you don't do it, I'll do this, I'll do that. Just wait until you hear from the principal, or just wait until I call your parents. And it's very angry and threatens the child. Then there's the democratic response. It's very, very reasonable, focuses on internal controls and decision making. It treats the student as an intelligent being, and we like this response. You could see a metaphor there as working in a well-coached team, right? So lots of good stuff there, but we could take it a step further to redemptive response, right? Redemptive discipline is compassionate. It prepares the child for moral self-government, right? And it reflects the character of God and treats the student as a candidate for heaven. And one of the things that you will find with this redemptive response, Charity, if we can go to the next slide, is that the message that you're sending to the child consistently is, I love you too much to let you unknowingly destroy yourself and others, right? So we're not being cruel or coercive. We're not being permissive. There is some room for thinking through consequences and those kinds of things, rules, thinking through them together as in a democratic response. But in the end, the message is out of a loving heart that won't let you just get up and walk out of class for any kind of reason, that won't let you just kind of sleep through the lessons, because I know that you have better in you, right? And as we go on, we're going to talk a little bit more about getting to why students are actually exhibiting the behaviors that they exhibit. I like these metaphors. I want to give you these metaphors, and then we'll talk about some examples. The metaphor of the authoritarian response is the iron rod, right? The metaphor of the permissive response is like a lollipop, right? Everything is sweet, everything is sugary. The metaphor of the bombastic response is like heat lightning that sometimes strikes, right? We've all had those kinds of people in our lives who have responded to us in that way. The democratic metaphor is a well-coached team. And then the redemptive response is where we're focused, is a garden carefully tended, right? A garden carefully tended, that these students are worth us pouring our love and our tender care into. And over time, if we cultivate them as we would plants in a garden, if you will, they will grow into the loving beings that Christ intended them for. Let me just pause right there and see if any of this is resonating with you.
Oh, perfectly. I'm soaking it up. I think the different responses that you just described are responses I see in with my colleagues in response to the behaviors that Charity described. And so, it's amazing that, I'm hearing this, and because I've always felt that the democratic response is the most appropriate response, but you're saying that the redemptive response is the better of the two responses, and the one that we should strive to use more often when dealing with students. Sometimes it's when you use democratic or the redemptive response, you'll come across as weak or permissive, if you will. And if you agree with that, but that's the impression I get sometimes, that if you're not using the iron fist approach or the bombastic or the lightning rod approach, then you're not really being a teacher. You're not being someone who's in control of the situation.
Right. So good. I'm glad you mentioned that in terms of being in charge of the situation. If we go to the next slide. So I just want to bring out 3 examples, and I think they'll all resonate with you, particularly the second and third example, based on the context that you described. But I want to start with elementary routines and communication, right? So if we are working with young children, it is so important for us to have regular routines, to practice transitions for them, to set expectations and procedures early on. So when you go into school, like, you could spend the first week or 2 of school without touching necessarily very much content, academic content per se. But if you spend that time to establish routines, look, how do we get up and line up if we're going to transition to another classroom or to another space in the school, or to go out for recess? How do we use the restroom? Like, what are the routines and what are the protocols for doing that? What's the protocol if someone talks out of turn, right? Are you just going to get an angry look, and is someone going to shout at you, or is there going to be something where you are now self-monitoring? Maybe it's a little flag that goes up, or maybe a note written on the board, so that I see what you're doing. I see where you're headed with this, and I just want you to know that I love you too much to let you continue. So let's check that behavior, right? Let's talk about, for example, from some middle school boys that I taught. I walked into a classroom of middle school students, both boys and girls, but there were a group of boys, and they were not overtly trying to make trouble. They were just silly. They like to goof around, goofy boys. Okay, but they would not stop talking. I heard you describe that before. They would not stop talking, and everything that was said, if the peer made a comment in class, or if I made something that seemed like it was a little unusual, they would just tear up the classroom with silliness.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you've experienced that. So what I was able to communicate to them, first of all, was all the potential that I saw in them, and to let them know that I really cared about them. And then from there, I got to know where they were coming from. Like, what are your interests? What are the things that you've gone through or not gone through in your life to get to this point? So I'm having these one-on-one conversations with them, right? This is after class or before class. I'm doing some digging. And then finally, we get to the point where if they were to continue, I would say, we're going to conference around this, maybe with your parents, and not as punishment, but to see in love how we can really get to the place where I'm understanding what's going on. Now, I'll give you an example, and Charity might pick up on this a little later. I found out that one of those boys had lost his father in a very violent incident. And that was causing him, in a way, to really act out in ways that seemed inappropriate in the classroom. But once I began to understand that, then my response to him was a lot different. And I was able to offer him some strategies to, like, when you get to this point where you think you just want to shout out in class, listen, here's something that you want to think about, right? And how that will impact you in the goals that you have going forward. And it very, very successful, right? So making those messages personal for students, not punishing the whole class just because a couple people are acting out, and making sure that they understand, I love you too much to let you go down this road, and I'm going to work with you to be sure that you get to the place where God intends you to be, right?
Mm.
So taking it from there, Charity's going to start to dig in to the why that informs our responses. I alluded to that, and she's going to carry us forward in getting to the why.
So, as Michael stated, when he understood why a student was acting out, it changed something in him so that he could respond differently. And so I wanted to share with you about ACEs. Have you heard about ACEs? It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study.
No.
Okay, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study actually started as a healthcare study in helping people to lose weight, and that studying obese people and how to help them lose weight. And what they were finding was, and there was one in particular person, but there was a wide variety of people who shared this, that they just were super successful with. This person went from being morbidly obese to being in a healthy range. Things were great. And within a short number of months, like within a year, maybe a little longer, had regained all the weight. And so they asked, what got in your way? How can we help you from a medical perspective? And what resulted was a disclosure of childhood sexual abuse.
Mm.
And so that got them curious. And so there was thousands of college age, primarily Caucasian, at that time in the study, people who they began to ask basically 10 questions about between birth and age 18, how many of the following have you experienced? So in your mind, you can answer these for yourself. We won't ask you to share your number. But abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Neglect, physical neglect, as well as emotional neglect. In the households that you grew up in, was there anyone in the household that had a mental illness, particularly a caregiver? Was anyone behind bars at any time incarcerated? Was there any domestic violence? Was there any substance abuse? Was there any divorce? So if you think about just yourself, then you can compare it yourself with the number of adverse childhood experiences reported a bit later in the study as it's continued to grow. So 14% of people, and remember this is college completed, working Caucasian people, looking back on their childhood, 14% had experienced 4 or more of the things that we just described. 8% had experienced 3. 13% had experienced 2. 24% had experienced one, and 41% had not experienced any at all. So there is a significant number, over 50%, that have experienced some form of adverse childhood experience. And what has happened is that study has continued and grown, made huge impacts, or is beginning to make huge impacts in the medical world and in the education world and in the social work world. And what has been found is over a ton of studies that have happened since 1985, that first study, they've discovered that there's a dose-response relationship between the number of untreated adverse childhood experiences and the negative health and well-being across a lifetime. So what that means is if you had the more untreated adverse childhood experiences that you have, the more health problems, all range of health problems, that you will have across your lifetime. It affects your life expectancy. And so notice that it was talking about untreated ACEs. So there is hope. There are ways to support our students and ourselves in healing from those adverse childhood experiences. But we need to recognize that their adverse childhood experiences reach across every ethnicity, every culture, every socioeconomic standing. It's pervasive. And it is scientifically, statistically significant that it makes an impact on our world and on our being. So then we have to look at what is trauma, right? If these adverse childhood experiences have happened, how do we then define the trauma itself, not just those 10 items, because those 10 items have expanded over time to include other areas. So we can look at a trauma definition as this: an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. So in Michael's case, he found out that a student had the loss of a parent. That is certainly an exceptional experience that was powerful and dangerous for him. It certainly had overwhelmed his capacity to cope. However, even if we as teachers do not know, and most of the time we will not know in great detail the trauma that has impacted our student lives, we know that over 50% on a pretty loose scale, over 50% of our students have trauma. Mm-hmm. So it really doesn't matter what it is. It's the fact that what has been experienced by over 50% of our students in any given classroom has gone beyond their ability to cope. And we're wanting them to come and learn our algebra and learn our Bible and learn our things that we are trying to inform them at school. And then we look at complex trauma, and that's the constant exposure. So it's simultaneous or sequential occurrences of childhood maltreatment that includes emotional abuse and neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence, particularly when it's chronic and begins in early childhood. So I'm not sure if you can see on your phone there, but I do have some pictures. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, you'll see a picture of two brains. Mm-hmm. A 3-year-old child. The brain on the left is a normal size brain.
Okay.
The picture on the right is a 3-year-old's brain that has experienced extreme neglect. What do you notice about the differences in the brain?
And these brains are from 3-year-olds.
This is 3-year-old children. Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's significantly larger than the one on the right.
Yeah, so the impact of trauma on the brain affects the actual brain size.
Wow.
And so sometimes we look at student responses and we haven't thought of the the physiological effects of the trauma in a child's life and their ability in the classroom. Now, there is still hope. This is not a death sentence, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have to recognize that there's physiological responses. Now, in the picture up in the upper right-hand corner, there on the left is a healthy brain. And in the circles, you'll see the temporal lobes. And those temporal lobes are active. They're in the orange and red color, some yellow, some green. Those are the most active temporal lobes. This is a PET scan. On the right-hand side is a PET scan of an abused brain. And you can see that the temporal lobes are on the least active.
Mm.
So the temporal lobes are not functioning.
Yeah.
And so we have to recognize that trauma has a physiological effect on our body and our brain development.
Mm.
So we have to kind of ask the right questions, because when our students have those behaviors, those challenging student behaviors that we've identified in flight, fight, and freeze, so often, and myself included, have gone, "What's wrong with you? We are trying to learn something here. Why are you doing, sit down," right? And we're asking the question, "What's wrong with you?" And we need to move from asking the question, "What's wrong with you?" to ask, "What happened to you?"
Oh, wow.
What happened to you? It comes with, and by asking that question, ourselves are coming from a different positionality. We're coming as learners, we're coming as humble, we're coming as partners, not as judges. And as we ask what happened to you, and we're coming from that place of compassion that comes with that redemptive discipline that Michael was talking about, we also move toward what's right with you.
Mm.
Because we can very quickly, if we only focus on trauma and the things that are wrong, we can really come from a deficit mindset. The beautiful thing about being Christian and about believing in redemption is that there is hope. And did make all of us. We are all candidates for heaven. And so we can ask, what's right with you? What can we champion as the gift that God has put into you and help you cultivate the gifts that God has given you? Because every child has them. So then we have to revisit the perceptions. So on your screen, you'll see some Bernstein bears. I love the Bernstein bears. And this is a picture of what the world will look like if, when you were growing up, you did not have those adverse childhood experiences. You learned, even as a baby, that when you cried, your parents came and took care of you. And you could cry and they would change your diaper. And hundreds of thousands of times, when you were helpless, your caregiver was safe and trustworthy and took care of you. And so that stable environment means that the students who have not experienced those adverse childhood experiences, or even ourselves who haven't experienced those adverse childhood experiences, see the world this way. And if you look at the balloons, they're smiling. If you they're singing a happy tune. Even if you look at the little animals in the lower left-hand corner, they're smiling and happy. And our students who have this lens come to school ready to learn. And they're able to just go, yep, teach me that math problem, teach me that literature, piece of literature. However, those that have adverse childhood experiences haven't had healthy attachment, and therefore they view the world through different lenses. And so if you look at this picture, all of a sudden the balloons have angry and sad faces. The people are looking like, what's going on? Who's going to come out behind me and get me? And even the little animals in the lower left-hand corner are looking mischievous and looking like they're on high alert. And so if you think back to the brains that we saw, the healthy brains, both the size and the activity of the brain, and then the unhealthy brains, the high trauma brains, you have seen the physiological difference. And then these pictures help us to see the lens in which that then affects the way that our kids see the world. And what that looks like in our classrooms can be called the window of tolerance. So if you look here, there's student A and student B. Student A has this lower black line that has their stress level. And student B has their stress level much higher. And then there's a breaking point. And the breaking point, or the window of tolerance, is the amount of stress anyone can take without freaking out on someone. And so, do you think student A or student B would be able to tolerate more stress? Are you there? Hello? Hello? Let's pause this.